This is Introduction to Politics, lecture number 11. I have mentioned in previous lectures two ways of understanding life in the polis, or politics. And that's interesting enough, when we hear the word politics, it comes from a Greek word, polos. We get our word police, but also we get our word polite from the Greek word of polis. And the Greeks understood there would always be tensions over what is the best way forward as a people, as a culture, economically, over property, for different ways of understanding for the Greeks war and how they interacted with others. But the whole notion in the midst of conflict, in the polis, could they be polite to one another in the midst of differences, stark differences, in how they understood a range of hot button issues in their time. The word police also emerges from the Greek word. But two ways of looking at politics then. Through the text we've been looking at, obviously, the role of formal politics, and with informal politics, the institutions which emerge from that, not only political parties in a representative democracy, which are meant to embody through voting, and then the role they play within governments in Canada at a federal, provincial, and municipal level. And so these are formal politics, and when most people think politics, they tend to think the role of MLAs, MPs, constitutions, executives, legislature, judicial elements of politics, the role of the state and authority. When many people in political science study political science, this tends to be the focus. Along with that, of course, goes issues such as elections, and certainly the debate within the West over first past the post form of democracy versus proportional representation. First past the post, you can have someone winning 51% of the vote to 49%, and hence they're the ones who are chosen to represent a riding, and yet they don't represent the people. And if democracy is about representing the demos, or the people, or the rule of kratia demos, the rule of the people, first past the post is a very inadequate and inept way of actually the people being represented at the places in which significant decisions are made at national levels, Canada provincial, American state levels, or Europe various levels also. So obviously there has been, certainly in Canada, the last few decades, a move to proportional representation, and many with first past the post will argue it leads to paralysis, it leads to crippling of decisions. But in fact, some of the best states in Europe, which have a very subtle and layered and well thought out proportional representation, in fact, first of all, it represents the people in a much more thoughtful way in terms of the demos being represented. And so, but often first past the post people will find 1,000 reasons to oppose proportional representation without saying, well, where are the states, in fact, where it is used, and how does it flourish, and how does it bring about a good in which the people, the demos, are represented. So that's another area, though, of formal politics, the voting system, the structures of politics, the parties of politics. And so that's one way in which, when one enters the world of the political, it's the formal level of politics. But underneath the formal level of politics is the whole level of what we would call cultural politics, or parapolitics, in which the hot button issues are debated intensely through media, Facebook, Twitter, through many other means, through media organizations, both on the right and the center, on the left. And people's minds are formed and forged. The selective information is offered. People go cherry picking with certain facts and statistics. They ignore others that don't fit in. So the media plays a very important role, and various forms of media play a very important role in disseminating certain interpretive facts. And one always has to ask, when watching anything in the media, what is being revealed? How is the story being told? what is not being revealed, and how could the story be told differently. And so, in an age of culture wars, one of the great dilemmas is within ideology itself. People selectively go picking the facts that feed into their ideology, and what doesn't fit, um, then it's just ignored, it's subordinated, it's canceled. And so the media, in terms of its role in public information, even those who see themselves as neutral or above the ideological fray, they themselves are also a part of the ideological fray. Even neutrality is a form of ideology, just as cynicism is a form of ideology. I often ask my students, why are cynics not cynical of cynicism? Why are skeptics not skeptical of skepticism? And so there is a form, obviously, of cultural politics where people only see the negative. They always pick on the imperfect. They always pick on the hypocritical. And they fail to see the good that parties and institutions imperfectly deliver. Cynicism, by its very nature, if not understood properly, leads to impotent human beings, paralyzed human beings who all they know how to do is, the word cynic in Greek is kynos. It just means a dog that barks, and barks at what it's fretful of, what it doesn't understand. But certainly in ideology and politics, a thoughtful person diagnoses what the issue was, or they bark at what they don't like. But that's just the first step. The second is prognosis. So what creatively is being articulated, and is it prudentially possible to embody what is being articulated? Then the third part is the practical. So how does one see the ideal proposed in terms of being implemented in an imperfect way within politics? And so the media is always, in that sense, telling stories, some anecdotal stories, some ideologically driven stories in terms of the hot button issues of the culture wars. But certainly in the culture wars in our period of time, they can be very, very heated. They're usually people who are cynical of formal politics, so their understanding of the polis, or their engagement in the polis or in community, is usually reduced to various forms of online, Twitter, Facebook, podcasts, in which they get a certain number of followers, some who do very well, make a living at it. And so the issue is when people are grappling with these larger issues at a parapolitical or a sub-formal political level, the level of responsibility which is supposed to exist, say in the House of Commons or in Victoria, the legislature, or at a municipal level, that responsibility and accountability does not exist in the same way, because it's more freewheeling. It's laissez-faire. People can say what they want, interview who they want, ignore people that don't fit within their agenda. We can see this played out very clearly in terms of the hot button issues, the culture wars today, in terms of two traditions which people become very animated about as they hear these names. Obviously, people on the progressive left have concerns with certain Black issues, First Nations issues, environmental issues, race issues. There's a whole gender issues, identity issues, the LGBTQI issues. And so there are people who are apologists for these sort of liberal progressive ideas. Those who dare to ask minimal questions of them, like, for example, who's often seen as the right, a person like a Jordan Peterson, who's up and going again with his podcast, The Fourth Year. He's recently done an interview with Aya Hershey Ali, or a whole range of thinkers that he does. If you're on the progressive left, he's dismissed as a right-wing reactionary, and anyone who follows his weekly interviews, he tends to bring on people who are willing to, oddly enough, in liberal elements of liberal pluralism and deconstructionism, they deconstruct certain understandings of ideological progressivism, but in doing so, they're seen as right-wing reactionaries. They're often silenced on the left, which then burst free speech movement. And so many of the people who are Peterson keeners or Peterson followers are also very much avid free speech advocates, because they feel that within the progressive left, in fact, minimal critical questions are not allowed, or i.e. free speech is not allowed. And so they move over to the right in terms of their understanding of how one deals with the hot button issues in the culture wars. So we can see, when we look at the culture or cultural politics versus formal politics or party politics, cultural politics is very much divided at the present time between a certain agenda within the progressives, and they hang out their laundry list of issues, of how issues are to be interpreted, and they brook little or no opposition. There's a tornness, obviously, between the liberals, between those who take a strong stand on certain issues and brook little opposition, versus the pluralist form of liberalism, which recognizes one has to be careful about being too certain on any issues, because most issues also are shot through with ambiguity and uncertainty in how they're interpreted, what we call hermeneutics. The right in this whole debate, in terms of how it understands cultural politics, cultural Marxism, postmodernism, which they're reacting to these, is what they see as a simplistic interpretation of the troubling, controversial, difficult issues in the culture wars. So when we move from formal politics, which is very important, but often when one gets to cultural politics, there's a cynicism in regards to formal politics, and they feel that the free play or the marketplace of ideas via popular media or more establishment media is the best way to articulate or interpret issues. That then, of course, in the midst of the cultures, it's a very divided world at the present time, a very polarized world, in which, as I mentioned earlier, someone like a Jordan Peterson has assumed prominence, and with his return, certainly in 2021, anyone who follows his podcasts, the people he interviews, very much reflect a certain deconstructing of both liberal pluralism and liberal ideology in terms of issues which are front staged or prioritized, and how they're interpreted, and how often they silence any form of opposition. So, two levels of politics: formal politics, informal politics, or cultural politics, and certainly the culture wars, which we are in the midst of at the present time, which brooks often very little opposition depending on the tribe or the clan a person is in. And the lack of accountability, because each person can run their own station, as it were, and bring in their own guests, and there's no substantive accountability in terms of formal politics, where a person has to justify what they're doing before a court, i.e. House of Commons or legislature or even a city council. This is much more laissez-faire cultural politics, but it certainly is intense. And there's a desperate need for women and men to step forward, to transcend the tribalism in both sides, and recognize that both sides are they are onto something right, but both have their blind spots and Achilles' heel. And until both can recognize their good in the other position and the limitations of their own, people will essentially be stalled, embalmed intellectually, and frozen intellectually. And hence, culture will never move any way forward in a minimally mature manner.